Have you ever came across an idea and immediately thought, well, why doesn't that exist everywhere? Because that's exactly how I felt when I first heard about Canada's first crochet cafe. I remember seeing pictures online and thinking, oh my goodness, I would absolutely spend an entire afternoon there, seriously. Imagine just like walking into a coffee shop where instead of listening to loud music and people staring at laptops, like every single time I go into Starbucks, you hear conversations about yarn substitutions. Someone's untangling a skein that became a complete disaster, and there's another girl helping her untangle it. Someone is showing off the sweater sleeve they finally finished after frogging it probably 3 times. There's coffee, there's crochet, there's handmade gifts. Maybe there's a class happening around the corner, you know? It honestly sounded like someone had taken everything crocheters love and put it into one cozy little space.
Wow! Beautiful!
And I don't know about you, but I think most of us would have a wish for something like that. Because let's be honest, crochet can be such a solitary hobby. We spend hours and hours making beautiful things, usually stitching on the couch, on the floor. Maybe you have a cat trying to steal your yarn, you know, or explaining to our family for the 10th time that no, knitting and crochet are not the same thing. Like, get it together.
Get it all together and put it in a backpack.
It felt special. It felt like the kind of place where you could actually just exist with people who understood why finishing a sleeve is worth something to celebrate, you know? And judging by the response online, I definitely was not the only one who thought that. People were genuinely excited. There were news articles, people sharing it all across social media. Crocheters were saying, I wish we had one of these where I lived, and I still do. It was such a positive story, honestly. I smiled every time I saw one of her reels saying, you know, that there was another update done to the building or whatever. Because the crochet community doesn't always make headlines, you know? And when we do, it's usually because someone crocheted a wedding dress or covered a tree in granny squares or something silly. So seeing an entire cafe built around crochet felt kind of magical. But then a few weeks later, I started seeing something completely different. Not photos of coffee, not photos of people showing off their finished projects, questions. Started out as little questions that make you like stop scrolling for a second. I saw one post that asked, you know, have you looked at the crochet items? And I just remember like stopping dead in my tracks and going, oh no. Because we've all seen like how internet like controversies go. You know, someone notices something, everyone has an opinion, a day later everyone moves on. So I assumed, you know, that's what this was, you know, another internet argument that would just disappear over the weekend. But instead of disappearing, people, you know, started asking questions. Not accusations yet, just questions. People began like comparing photos, looking at the shelves more closely, recognizing stitch patterns, pointing out similarities that they noticed. And before long, the conversation had spread well beyond like the original few posts that I had seen. Eventually, one creator, who is a crochet creator, brought many of the like community concerns together in a YouTube video, which introduced the discussion to an even wider audience. I think like 20,000 people had watched that video. Not long after that, the cafe itself released a pretty lengthy statement, I guess you could call it. They acknowledged that some customer expectations, you know, weren't met, and they had apologized for where they had fallen short. And they explained, you know, some of the changes that they were making moving forward. And I think that's where the story became more interesting to me, not because I suddenly wanted to figure out like who was right. Actually, it was quite the opposite. You know, the more I read, the less interested I became in like choosing sides. Because something of the entire like conversation felt bigger. People were talking about crochet, but it felt like they were really talking about something else.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
You know, I watched like different perspectives. I read comments from crocheters, from customers, from, you know, other craft makers. from people that had visited the cafe and actually like made video reviews. And, you know, obviously those that hadn't, because, you know, they're in Canada, and I think this was pretty big in the US too. And somewhere along the way, I realized this wasn't becoming a story about a cafe anymore. You know, it had quietly become a conversation about something that affects almost every maker. And I have to admit, it made me think about my own expectations too a little bit. Before we get into what, you know, people were actually debating, I think we need to understand like why this cafe mattered so much in the first place. Because if it had just been another coffee shop, you know, I honestly don't think that we would still be talking about this or that it would be brought up. It represented something. And I think that's why so many people cared about what happened next. I want to stay in that like original excitement for just a little bit longer, because I think it's easy to forget now, you know, looking back, just how positive the conversation was in the beginning. When I first saw the photos of the cafe, I wasn't like analyzing anything. I wasn't zooming in on shelves. I wasn't, you know, comparing products. I was doing what I think most all of us were doing, and I was just imagining myself there. I was wishing that I was closer to Canada so that I could go visit. Unfortunately, I'm at the bottom of the US. Like, can you just picture it? You finish work on a Friday afternoon, right? And tomorrow is Friday, so I'm like just imagining this in my head. You grab your current project in hand, you know, probably one that was supposed to be finished 3 weeks ago, but you know, you're slowly, you know, getting it done, and you head to the cafe where everyone is already, you know, understands why you're there and why you're carrying a giant bag tote full of yarn. Like, nobody asks, what are you doing? What are you making? Why are you doing that in a cafe? Because everyone is making something. You know, one table has someone working like on a blanket, and another person has, you know, they're learning how to make a granny square for the first time. Someone is in the corner quietly like counting stitches under their breath because they've lost count 4 times now. Honestly, it just sounds like so wonderful. That's something that I have always said I wanted to open a coffee shop, and I think combining both crochet and coffee would just be a dream.
Have you ever had a dream that you had?
Honestly, I have told my husband this for several years now, that I want to make something like that. I think like, you know, that's because crochet isn't really about just crocheting. It's about slowing down. It's about creating something, you know, with your hands, sharing ideas, learning from people who have been crocheting longer than you, encouraging someone who has just started and they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Like, there's a reason there are so many local yarn shops that host stitch nights. There's a reason crochet groups meet in libraries, church, you know, coffee shops, and just other like general community areas. But we're also building connections. And the older that I get, yes, I am getting old, the more I realize that those spaces are actually pretty rare nowadays. There aren't many places where, you know, strangers sit together for 2 to 3 hours, you know, without just staring at their phones the whole time. You're not making any like real connections with people. So crochet kind of like creates that naturally, in my opinion. So when people heard, you know, about a cafe that's built around that idea, it wasn't just, oh cool, another coffee shop. It felt like someone had built a place like specifically for us, you know. And I think that's why so many people like became emotionally invested before they had ever even like walked in the doors. You know, it represented something. It was a place where handmade items mattered, where creativity mattered, where community mattered. Whether or not, you know, like expectations were realistic or were met, like that's genuinely how many people, you know, hoped it would be. And honestly, like I love the cafe. Even after everything that happened, like this video is not to diss on the cafe or the owner or anything like that. I am just specifically talking about, you know, the community and how this affected the community and why it affected the community. So, you know, I still think that the idea is so fantastic. It's honestly like a magical place, right? which is why I think the next part of the story surprised so many people, because, you know, it didn't start with like some investigative journalist or a big like expose or something like that, you know, or a dramatic headline. It just started with so many, you know, conversations. Someone noticed, you know, a small detail. Then another person said they noticed something similar. Then someone else said, oh, that actually looks kind of familiar. And suddenly, you know, people weren't just admiring the cafe anymore. They were looking closer, you know. Now, one thing I do want to be careful about here is separating like observations from conclusions, because those are two very different things. And at first, people weren't saying like, here's exactly what happened. Like, they were saying, can someone explain this? Am I seeing this right? You know, has anyone else noticed this? And I think that's a very different like kind of conversation. And I think it's important to recognize that, because as more comparisons were shared online, crocheters started doing, you know, what crocheters do best. They look at the stitches. They look at the construction of the item. They looked at the details most people don't notice. Eventually, you know, one crocheter, I think her name was Made with April, I think is what her name was. She, you know, kind of made a YouTube video that literally spelled out all of the concerns and like questions that the community as a whole was already asking. She wasn't like specifically like dissing on the cafe in a very bad way. She was just kind of calling out like why it was important that it be discussed. And you know, it did reach a lot of people. Some people agreed, some didn't. Some appreciated like having everything summarized in one place. Others, you know, worried that the conversation was becoming like a little heated, and thought that they were like attacking the owner. But, you know, regardless of where people landed, the discussion had grown from that point, you know, far beyond just like a few Instagram comments or, you know, small, you know, stories here and there of people just like having those little questions. Then the cafe responded and they published a pretty detailed like public statement. And what I appreciated about reading it was that it wasn't simply just defensive. You know, they had acknowledged that people had expectations and, you know, not all of those were met. They had apologized for where those expectations were and why they weren't met. They talked about like the changes that they were making, things like reviewing products more carefully, strengthening their vendor process, and just increasing transparency moving forward. So whether someone like felt that those changes were enough or whether they wished like they had happened sooner, ultimately like that's for each person to decide, you know. But I do think it's important to include that part of the story, because too often internet conversations freeze people in the moment, and you know, we remember the criticism but we forget what happened afterward. And in this case, there was an afterward, there was a response, there was reflection, and there were changes. And the cafe is very successful now. She did have, you know, the time to grow over the past like 7 months or something. And, you know, I think I love that for them. I'm so excited for her. I'm so excited that the cafe is like still being supported and is, you know, running and everything. It makes me so happy. But that doesn't mean that like every question just disappeared. It doesn't mean that suddenly everyone agreed, you know, but it does make the story like a little bit more complete. And strangely enough, like reading the statement is what finally made me realize like I couldn't stop thinking about all of this, because by that point I wasn't wondering, you know, where individual like crochet items had come from anymore. I was kind of like wondering why this story had affected crocheters so differently than it probably would have affected almost anyone else, you know? Because I honestly think like if you look at this exact same situation and replaced crochet with almost any other hobby, the reaction wouldn't have been nearly as strong. So, you know, I thought to myself, what makes crocheters different? You know, why did so many of us look at this story and immediately felt like there was something bigger at stake? I think the answer has everything to do with the way crocheters see the world. And once I realized that, everything started to make a little bit more sense. So I think it comes down to something that we don't even realize we've trained ourselves to do. So let me ask you something. Have you ever walked through like a craft fair or a yarn shop like Hobby Lobby recently, or even just like a department store, and immediately spotted like a crochet item that halfway across the room? not because it was your style necessarily or because you wanted to buy it, just because your brain immediately went, oh, that's crochet, I want to go see that. I do this all the time. Like, I'll be walking through, like clotheslines with my kids. My eyes have already wandered over to like a crochet looking bag that's on display. And I'm not even like trying to look for it, if that makes sense. I just notice it. And once I notice it, my brain starts doing something that I don't think most people do, that if you're not a crocheter, I start looking at the stitches. I start looking at the shaping, the construction, the yarn. I start wondering, how do they make that? Is that worked in one piece? Like, how many color changes did that take? Like, oh, I like how they did that border. So please tell me I'm not the only one, because I'm like, am I just weird? Am I crazy? I think every crocheter does this. And so we've accidentally like trained ourselves to see the work hiding behind the finished project. I truly believe that. A non-crocheter might look at like a bee and think, oh, that's so adorable. But a crocheter looks at the exact same item and thinks that's probably like took 3-4 hours. I wonder if the wings were, sewn on before the stuffing. Those safety eyes are like really well placed. Like, wow, they actually like got the stripes to line up really good, like the color changes. Like, we just can't help ourselves.
Daddy, chill.
I like to think of it as like a superpower. Like, I can spot those things so quick. I don't know, maybe it's a curse. I'm still undecided. But it doesn't stop there. Like, when someone shows us a blanket, we don't just see a blanket. So this is the one I'm currently working on. I love this project. It has taken me so long though, because I just can't focus enough to like actually work on it. But so we like, when we see something like that, we see like evenings after work, we see sore wrists, we see, weaving in what feels like 14,000 ends if you're color changing all the time. We see like the moment that you realized you'd somehow added an extra stitch and it was like 4 rows down and you're like, son of a bitch, do I frog all of this, or do I just pretend it's not there? So the point is, like, crocheters don't just see the finished project. We see the time, the effort, the learning, the mistakes, the patience. We see the person behind it. And I think that's really what matters, because if you've spent hundreds or maybe even thousands of hours learning this craft and learning how to crochet, you kind of develop like a completely different relationship with handmade things. You know how difficult they are to make. You know how much practice goes into getting your tension consistent. You know that like a simple looking cardigan might represent weeks or maybe even months of work. That one tiny plushie that someone says, oh, that must have been so quick, actually took like the entire Sunday. When crocheters talk about handmade, we're not like talking about aesthetic. We're talking about labor, time, skill, creativity, patience, love, sometimes frustration.
And I'm addicted, so I can't quit.
Definitely frustration, actually, like, gosh. Honestly, I think crochet teaches patience whether you wanted to learn it or not, because this hobby has like a funny way of humbling us all. You think, oh, I'll just make this one little gift for Christmas for someone. 3 weeks later, you're still weaving in the freaking ends and questioning every life decision on why you had this idea in the first place. And yet we keep coming back to it, because making something with your own hands feels different. It connects you to the object in a way that's, hard to explain to someone who doesn't make things. And that's why I think like handmade means so much more to so many people. Not because handmade is like automatically better, not because wholesale is automatically bad, but because handmade tells a story. Someone sat down, picked their yarn, made choices, fixed mistakes, started over, and that's just a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful process. And I think crocheters like instinctively recognize that story, that process of events, even if they never, met the person that made it, which brings me back to the cafe. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that people weren't just reacting to crochet items on a shelf. They were reacting to what those crochet items represented, or what they maybe thought they represented. And I know those sound like the same thing, but I actually don't think they are, because expectations are funny. Sometimes we don't even realize we created them until they're challenged, right? Think about it. If you walked into like a regular gift shop and saw a mix of handmade products and wholesale items, would you think twice? Honestly, probably not. Like, lots of small businesses do that. It's like incredibly common. Running a retail business is expensive. Inventory is complicated. Margins are tight. You know, most people understand that. Why did this feel so different? And I kept asking myself that over and over. And eventually one thought kept coming back. Maybe the conversation was never really about the products. Maybe the products were simply the thing that made people, you know, stop and ask a much bigger question. And once that idea popped into my head, I couldn't stop thinking about it, because I think the real conversation was hiding in plain sight the whole time. People kept saying transparency matters. Others said running a small business is hard. Some focused on the products. The coffee was like almost secondary. People were excited about what the cafe represented. It felt like a celebration of handmade, a place built by people who loved crochet, for people who, you know, wanted community. And that is like built on trust. That's built on shared values. You know, once people started like actually looking into the, you know, items on the shelves, it was quickly realized that most of the crochet items that they were listed were wholesale. And what that means is simply that someone somewhere spent a lot of time making these really, really precise and really adorable items, and probably got paid pennies for it. Because if you're selling, you know, an item for $7 and you're mass producing it, you're not getting paid very well for that. And so I think that was like the biggest eye-opening moment of, wow, this, you know, is supposed to value handmade. It's like represent a community that, you know, values the time and the energy and the work and the compensation that should go into something like that. And it didn't, because those were all purchased from a wholesale vendor. And so what I loved about what the cafe had to say in their response was that they weren't, you know, denying, and they weren't trying to shut down the conversation in a bad way. They did try to, you know, ask that people stopped talking about it. But they did acknowledge that there were some expectations that weren't met, and that they were going to change things going forward. And to be fair, I think this person was a fairly new crocheter at the time. However, she wasn't brand new. I think she had said, you know, in her story that she had started crocheting when COVID happened. So to me, if you have been crocheting for at least 4 years at that point, you should know the value of the work. You should know the value of the time and the energy that goes into this craft. And personally, I think that that was not true. I don't think that that was something that she just like overlooked. Because at the end of the day, you had plenty of time to think about why you were doing what you did. Think about why you were purchasing those items. You know, there were many opportunities for you to have the like vendor program set up and finished well before, you know, the opening date. And to me, it just seemed like cutting corners and hoping no one would notice. And I know that's kind of harsh to say, but that's just like my opinion that I had when I was, you know, deep into this story. Is it truly felt like, you know, she was just trying to get everything set up in time for the opening. So like I said at the beginning of this video, I think that they have definitely improved and done really well for themselves since all of this happened in December of last year, I think. And so I wanted to highlight that this story does not end on a bad note. In my opinion, I think that this sparked a lot of real conversation in the crochet community about, it wasn't just about the flowered, you know, crochet items. It wasn't just about the products that weren't sourced, you know, the most ethically if you were claiming to be like a crochet, you know, centered cafe. I don't think it was necessarily about any of that. I think it was more so that crocheters know the craft so well. We know the work, the time, the money, because, you know, yarn and stuff is not cheap. We know the dedication, the long nights trying to like learn a new stitch. Like, we know all of that. We know how difficult it is to price our items to where we feel like we're fairly getting paid, but also like what someone would realistically pay for something. You know, we've been to the markets where we have sold nothing. We've been to the markets where we've sold out and we're like, oh my gosh, this is the best. Like, this is more than I could ever ask for. And so we know all those things. We analyze things like that just by looking at a product, because we can put ourselves in that person's situation that made that item. So if it's not being ethically made, because let's just be real, mass-produced crochet items are not ethical. And Hobby Lobby, I'm talking about you with your crochet flowers. I think at the end of the day, it just sparked a very deep conversation across the crochet community about ethical crochet business. It sparked conversations about fair pay for crocheters. It sparked conversations about being a actual community, and you know, if you have the ability to utilize local vendors and stuff for your crochet cafe, whether it be crochet or not, could just be like other craftsmen. It's more about the values and the trust and the transparency that should have gone into this, you know, launch for the cafe. Because I think once everyone started to notice that, I think the internet was pretty divided by, you know, they just opened, then give them a chance versus you should have known better, you know. But anyways, I wanted to end this video with a positive, and you know, I'm not trying to attack the cafe whatsoever. I actually, you know, if I could, I would go there tomorrow with my bag full of crafts and I would spend an entire afternoon there and just love every second of it. I wouldn't want to leave. If I had one here, it would be dangerous because I would be there constantly. I think that at the end of the day, the owner did learn, you know, a very hard lesson, because she was bashed pretty hardly on the internet. I think that the community itself has had really good conversations since then. It's brought up a lot of serious things. This video is not to bash on her whatsoever. It was more so to just talk about how something so silly and so little, like a crochet flower set, and other, you know, small little trinkets, could have caused such a controversy in the crochet community. So my ending question for you is, if a crochet cafe opened near you, what would be the most important thing to you? Would it be the vendor process, the transparency, or just the trust in the cafe's sourcing and stuff like that? Also, I know some of my viewers are in El Paso, which is where I am, and if I was to open one, would you come? Because, you know, not me silently trying to do some market research. But anyways, I appreciate you so much for spending your afternoon or your morning or your night, whatever time it is, crocheting with me. I would love to know what project you're working on down in the comments, or you can post a picture on my community page. I would love to see it. This is how far I got. I got one complete row in on my blanket, and this is how big it is. It's pretty big. So that is my project of the day. I love this blanket. I can't wait for it to be done so I can, you know, block it and wash it and stretch it out and just have it as my new couch blanket. I'm so excited. So anyways, that is it for today's video. Until next time, happy crocheting, and I will see you later. Bye.